It's that time again. The annual conference of the American Society of Ag Consultants, otherwise known as ASAC, is going to be held in Fort Myers, Florida, this November 4th and 5th. Kurt Covington is one of 9 professionals who will address the conference. The other speakers who will cover a wide range of topics represent Florida Farm Bureau, Florida Citrus Commission, University of Tennessee Institute of Agriculture, National Ag Law Center, Risk Mitigators and Advisors, Tyler Associates, as well as the lead economist for dairy at CoBank, and myself, Chrissy Wozniak from North American Ag. The day and a half of presentations will be followed by ag tours on Tuesday afternoon at Echo Farms, one of my favorite places here in Fort Myers. Attendees will experience farming at its most creative, with unique demonstrations, plants, and techniques being used to help farmers and urban gardeners in developing countries. A second tour at Echo will showcase simple technologies that can improve food, water, and shelter for millions of people. A third tour of a hydroponic grower is also being planned. For more information and to register, visit www.agconsultants.org. That's www.agconsultants.org. See you there. And welcome to North American Ag Spotlight. I'm Chrissy Wozniak. My returning guest today is a powerful voice in the cattle industry who's testified on behalf of R-Calf USA members before Congress and the executive branch agency. He's managed numerous lawsuits on behalf of the organization and is the organization's registered lobbyist. R-Calf USA is the largest producer-only, membership-based organization that exclusively represents U.S. cattle and sheep producers on domestic and international trade and marketing issues. Today, we're going to talk about cattle traceability plans and how going down this road may bring us into a place that we don't want to go. From Billings, Montana, I'd like to welcome R-Calf USA CEO Bill Bullard. Welcome, Bill, and thank you so much for your time today.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you.
So I really enjoy your weekly commentary, and we always share it on our newsfeed at NorthAmericanAg.com. In your latest commentary really caught my eye because you ended by saying, how about we stand up for our liberty and freedom by just saying no, or would you like more ESG on your RFID? Pretty clever. So you seem to be one of the only voices piecing all this together and starting a discussion on it. So first off, can you tell me exactly what is RFID traceability and how does it work?
Well, the government has been trying to force upon the U.S. cattle industry a requirement to affix every animal with a radio frequency identification ear tag in order to identify the individual animal and to be able to trace that animal back to its birth of origin. And the government tried this with earnest back in the mid-2000s, but there was so much pushback from the industry because they realized that this was really being driven at the global level. There was a World Trade Organization and the World Organization for Animal Health that was pushing a regulatory requirement of traceability, including the RFID technology, upon every nation and all cattle around the world. And the United States, of course, is represented by many who are independent. And they looked at this from the perspective, well, how is this going to affect the bottom line of my operation, for example? Or what benefit is to be derived from a mandatory RFID system? And our producer said no, and the government was pushed back. They did not want to distill down or reduce what they were after, but they had to. And in 2013, they passed a law. It's by force of law. It's actually a regulation. And the regulation afforded cattle producers with options. They could choose to use an RFID ear tag for purposes of animal identification, or they could choose far less costly animal identification devices like metal ear clips, like brands, like tattoos, like back tags, like just what they call the plastic dangle tag that hangs from an animal's ear. And so producers had flexibility, recognized that there was a benefit to animal disease traceability in order to contain a disease outbreak, and they agreed to do this. But importantly, they have a choice. Well, now the government wants to force this upon the industry again. They want to make the only officially recognized animal identification device, a high-cost radio frequency identification ear tag, and they want to impose this mandate every time a cattle producer wants the privilege of shipping cattle across state lines. So it's the first phase. The government backed off due to the public pressure. Now they're back at it again. Their ultimate goal is to require every animal to be RFID ear tagged from the time that it is born until it is harvested or death occurs.
So is this at the cost of the producer then?
Well, certainly it is. The U.S. Department of Agriculture estimates, and we think on the low side, it's going to cost about $29 million just to ear tag the 11% of the cattle that are expected to cross state lines. The cost will be borne by the producer. And of course, producers have been experiencing severely depressed prices for years, beginning in 2015. And many producers are having extreme difficulty and even recovering their cost of production from the marketplace itself. Now the government wants to require them to pay nearly $4 per head, and it may be more than that, maybe somewhat less. But nevertheless, it's an additional production cost to be borne by cattle producers without any promise of a return in the marketplace itself. And so what it will do is it will accelerate the ongoing demise, the ongoing exodus of cattle producers. And we've lost over 500,000 of them just in the past 4 decades. And so this is a terrible idea. Again, it's driven on the global level, and our government has acquiesced by the global dictates, and they're trying to force producers to use this. And we believe that it's far more sinister than that. There's also this effort to control the industry. And that's what the commentary was about here that you referred to.
Yeah, and digging in a little bit deeper about the global element. What is the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef? Who are they, and what's their reach?
So the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef is a global entity. It's what we call it a transnational private government acting organization on a global level. And it consists of some of the largest beef packers in the world. It consists of some of the largest world banks. It consists of some of the largest multinational ear tag companies. And it consists of many national or international retail outlets. So they've gotten together to decide how best to control the supply chain. And of course, independent cattle producers are an integral part of the beef supply chain. They provide the cattle, and the only ingredient in beef is cattle. So we're the input to the multi-segmented beef supply chain. And the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef consists of these very powerful global entities that wish to dictate the production standards in order to maximize their profits. So they are imposing arbitrary conditions upon producers and trying to get them to voluntarily participate. But it really isn't voluntary at all. Because when you have in the United States, for example, 4 packers controlling 85% of the fed cattle market, they can act as gatekeepers to the marketplace, and they can decide who does and who does not have timely access to the market, meaning they can impose conditions, production standards that must be met in order for a producer to have an opportunity to market his or her cattle when they're ready for harvest. And so we're seeing that today because some of these arbitrary global standards that have been established include what we call in our industry a beef quality assurance. It's simply a certification process where a producer has to incur additional costs and resources in order to be certified. And the certification is supposed to inform consumers that the animal has been treated humanely, that the transportation rules have been met, that vaccinations have been provided in the proper way. These are things that are just basic to animal husbandry that ranchers have been doing for decades. But now there's a certification process because the packers are scored on whether they're properly achieving these goals. And so they've begun to dictate that in order to have access to the market, we've seen 2 of the largest packers now imposing a requirement that if you want to sell cattle to them, you have to meet this specific production standard. And then it grows even larger than that, because what the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef really wants to do, and we have a U.S. roundtable, there's a Canadian roundtable, an Australian roundtable, but they're all controlled at the international global level. And what they want to do is impose the ESG standards, the environmental, social, and governance standards, in order to ensure that cattle producers are on a path of continuous improvement. And the continuous improvement, of course, is the compliance to these arbitrary standards. So for environmental standards, for example, they're going to look at whether or not a cattle producer has a written plan to protect the soil, to protect the water, to protect the grazing lands, and to protect treating animals humanely. And so it's an imposition of additional production costs, and the benefit goes to the meat packer. And because these standards have been set by the World Bank as a means of comparing financial suitability for loans, the packers are seeking high scores. And they get high scores when they can impose these conditions upon the supply chain, meaning when they can dictate to producers, to ranchers, dictate to ranchers how to ranch. And that's what's happening here. So it's a huge element of control originating at the global level. The establishment of arbitrary standards, it wasn't established by U.S. cattle producers. These standards were imposed by these world banks and the multinational meat packers, the multinational ear tag companies, and it's all designed to ensure that the global elites, if you will, can control and dictate how cattle are produced, the production standards for those animals, and it's a carrot and stick. The stick, of course, is if you want access to the marketplace, that's very little of it is independent anymore, then you must comply. You must meet these standards regardless of the cost of meeting them, regardless of whether or not they are providing any benefits whatsoever to the environment, to the social community. So really what you have is an effort to shape culture in the United States. And it isn't being shaped by folks like you and I. It's being shaped by global elites who are able to set these standards and enforce compliance. And that's why I call this Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef a transnational private government, because they do have the ability to enforce. And their ability to enforce is based on their ability to control access to the marketplace. And so this is very dangerous to the liberty and freedom of independent-minded cattle producers all across the United States. And of course, this goes beyond the cattle industry. We have small businesses and manufacturers that are facing the same thing. They're now required to meet these new arbitrary standards in order to be recipients of needed loans for operating and for other reasons. In the cattle industry, it's more specific because of the bottleneck that we have at the marketing stage with the tremendous control that the multinational meat packers have over our industry.
Yeah, those are great points. And you're right. This isn't just the cattle industry. It's not just agriculture. This is sweeping out in all industries and all businesses. And so why, as a society, should we just be flat out rejecting the ideology altogether, or is there a way to work with them? What do you think?
Well, obviously, there's going to be some good recommendations because, as I said earlier, some of these recommendations are simply based on good animal husbandry practices that cattle farmers and ranchers have been practicing for decades. Now they put them in written form. Now you need to write a report. Now you need a certification. So it's additional costs for them to do what they already know they're doing. But there's more to it than that. There's some 30 different measuring standards that the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef eventually wants to achieve. But they're willing to start at a level where cattle producers would simply acquiesce to it without much of a fight. And so right now it's just reporting requirements. For example, carbon sequestration. They want to establish some baseline. So a report has to be written. And even on a cattle ranch that is primarily grazing lands where they're actually not just limiting the carbon footprint, they're actually benefiting the atmosphere as a result of the way they're operating. But nevertheless, they too would be required to have a baseline, measure how their progress, report to the meat packers their progress, so the meat packers can report to their lenders. And it's a vertically integrated effort to control the production and the culture of the cattle industry in the United States. And perhaps I've wandered off to your specific question, Chrissy.
No, that's good. And what about for, people that are just starting to see this issue, I guess, and maybe new to it all? Why, you've mentioned this, but why is globalization such a threat to liberty and independence? Shouldn't we all, and haven't we all been taught we just need to get along? And isn't that at a global level? What do you say to those people just dipping their toe into these ideas?
Right. So we've been on this bent to achieve globalization, which if you carry it to the furthest extent, what you're really talking about is a borderless world. And the means of achieving that, of course, were free trade agreements. And only recently has Congress and the public realized how detrimental these free trade agreements are to the United States. We see that we have outsourced our manufacturing. If we look at the sheep industry, it's a perfect example. We entered a free trade agreement with Australia in 2005. And in 2006, our U.S. sheep industry became the first livestock industry in America to be outsourced, because from that point forward, we began to rely more on imported lamb than our beleaguered sheep industry could anymore produce. And so today, for example, 74% of the lamb that's consumed in America is derived from imported sources. It's because we drove out our domestic producers. We've literally destroyed our commercial sheep industry in the United States, an industry that not too long ago had about 12 million sheep in the sheep flock on a national level. Now it's down to about 5 million. We wiped out untold number of sheep ranchers in the U.S. So we've essentially put at risk our national security. And we did that because of the global requirements that we have to have free trade, regardless of what impact that might have on an industry. We've outsourced not just the sheep industry. We're seeing a significant increase in imports that consumers are now relying upon for beef in the United States. And the cattle industry is the single largest segment of American agriculture. And it's critically important to rural communities because it's their economic base. It's the cornerstones of their economies all across the United States. It's a $70 billion industry, for example. But we can destroy the cattle industry just as we destroyed the sheep industry in the very same way. We can follow the global dictates and simply open our borders and facilitate more imports into this country. And as a result, we will continually weaken what is already a weak cattle industry in the United States. But it's the plan. And now Congress is beginning to understand how this has been extremely detrimental to the economic well-being of America. After outsourcing our manufacturing, we now rely far too extensively, even on national security type products. And we've lost our ability to be self-sufficient in food production and in energy and elsewhere. And so now the winds are changing. The pendulum has swung too far. Now we're beginning to realize that we need to rebuild America. And in order to do that, we have to dispense with this global notion. And we have to start doing what's right for America, what's right for our citizens and our consumers and our cattle farmers and ranchers. And so your question was, well, what can people do? Is there a way to work within this? And the answer is no. The way that we change this is to strike off in a new direction. We go back to allowing our independent cattle farmers and ranchers to raise cattle, the best that they know how to do, and they know better than the multinational meat packers seated in some boardroom somewhere, and let them produce for the consumer. The consumers will dictate what particular standards they would like their beef produced under, and our entrepreneurial cattle producers will meet that standard. And so we've essentially gone from a market-driven industry to a market-controlled industry on a global level, and the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef is the poster child of that.
Right. Wow, that's excellent points. The U.S. Cattlemen's Association, they recently said about this knowing where diseased and at-risk exposed animals are, as well as where they have been and when, is indispensable to emergency response and ongoing disease control and eradication programs. So you've proposed an alternative, but what's an alternative for this? Is there an updated model where we can see without all of this control from the global level?
Yeah, so the U.S. cattle farmers and ranchers have invested millions upon millions in achieving the ability to control and contain disease outbreaks. You know, some of the most pernicious diseases known to cattle include foot and mouth disease. And we actually had that in 1929. We imported it from Argentina. But we had the ability, the cattle producers worked together with the government, animal health officials, and it was contained and it was eradicated. We've had other diseases like brucellosis and tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is extremely difficult because we continually re-import that disease in Mexican cattle. And we have brucellosis and tuberculosis controlled in the United States, but for wildlife populations, like in the greater Yellowstone area and in Michigan, for example, we still have problems. But that was the very purpose of this 2013 regulation that I talked about. It was for cattle that are being shipped across state lines. They would need to be identified so that we could achieve that level of disease traceability. And it's working. It's working extremely well. It has worked for decades. So the weak points that we have are not in the ability of cattle producers to work with animal health officials to contain and control diseases. The weak point we have is we have a government that has systematically reduced and relaxed our import standards so that we are now importing beef and cattle from countries that we know have pernicious animal diseases, foreign animal diseases. New Mexico was a good example. We actually have in Canada, for example, some close to their wildlife preserves, they have brucellosis problems as well. So we are purposefully introducing foreign animal diseases. And what the government wants is they want to continue to relax that because they're still dinosaurs to the extent that they still are pursuing this idiocy globalization goal of theirs. And what they want to do is they want to force the containment and management upon the shoulders of independent cattle producers. So rather than maintain strict border controls, they want to relax those controls. And by doing so, they know they are exposing our industry to a greater risk of foreign animal diseases. And so they want the Cadillac version, if you will, of an animal disease traceability. Obviously, if you had animal RFID ear tags, you could trace animals back as effectively as you can with a metal ear tag that has a number associated with the individual animal that's also associated with the place of birth. And so we have the ability to control and contain diseases. What the government cannot show is that they need the high-cost radio frequency identification ear tags to do so, because they have been highly successful at doing it presently, giving these producers the flexibility to choose what type of animal identification device is needed in order to achieve the disease traceability goal. So we've been highly successful. The government has turned their head away from where the most serious problems are, and they even in this rulemaking process that's underway right now, based on the government's effort to force mandatory RFID on every producer who wants the privilege to sell cattle across state lines. Even in that proposed rule, the government acknowledges that they have made tremendous headway in reducing the time it takes to do a disease traceback in the event of an outbreak. And they have done that because of the very flexibility that was afforded in the 2013 rule. But where they say that they fall short is that they have not also required the electronic recordings of certificates for veterinary inspections, for example, and other animal movement records. These are still done on paper, and the government complains that by doing it on paper, they're subject to error, subject to miswriting the actual number, transcribing the number, and they're subject simply to having to pick up a phone and make a phone call. So the government told us what they can do to significantly increase their capacity to trace back animal diseases. And the most important one is to digitalize all of these paper records that are part and parcel to every disease traceback. So But instead, rather than doing what they view to be more difficult, to get that paperwork transcribed into an electronic format, they want to force all the cattle producers at the end of the chain here to incur this additional cost. And again, it's because the goal isn't animal disease traceability. The goal is ultimate control. The goal is to comply with the dictates at the global level. And that's what's the driving force on this. We fully recognize that in the event of a disease outbreak, we need to work aggressively to stamp the disease out. And we've worked in partnership with the federal government to do that. And the 2013 regulation has enhanced our ability to achieve that. Now we know the government has some gaping holes that need to be filled, and yet they simply don't want to do that. It's far easier to force this mandate upon producers, but it's not going to increase the speed at which we're able to do a disease traceback, because they still have to work their paper process for all of the animal disease records, all of the movement records that would be necessary to conduct a disease traceback from wherever the animal is identified to wherever it originated from.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what can people do? Is this as simple as giving a call to, your House of Representatives, your senators? What can we do?
Well, interestingly, while the government wants to force every cattle producer to use a radio frequency identification ear tag, they are resistant to allowing consumers to know where their beef came from. This also stems back to the globalization. So one way to counteract what is happening here is to require mandatory country of origin labeling on every beef product sold in a grocery store. So consumers know whether the animal from which the beef was derived was born, raised, and harvested in the United States, or if it was born in one country, raised in another, and harvested in the United States. So in other words, whether it's partial or wholly an imported product, or is it exclusively a domestic product? And when you do that, when consumers are able to initiate those demand signals, then you take away the leverage that the multinationals have over the domestic marketplace, because now it's not the multinationals determine where to source this beef in order to satisfy consumer demand. Now it's the consumers determining from what country they want their beef produced. And when you do that, you start to rebuild the economic stratus for cattle producers. You provide them with more opportunities. We have the ability to improve and expand, and we don't need to be dictated to on a global level to achieve this. So we need to start local in our marketplace. Consumers deserve to know where their beef comes from. They can do that by calling their members of Congress and saying, we want to know where our beef comes from, so we want mandatory country of origin labeling. And we don't want the cattle marketplace to be restricted to the point where if four of the packers decide that they want to impose an arbitrary production standard, which would drive the price of cattle or drive the cost of producing cattle up, consumers can help there too. So it's really a mindset and a movement, but there are some concrete things we can do. We can restore competition, because only without competition are these global efforts successful in the United States. Because if producers were not strapped financially, they would do what they do best rather than listen to what dictates have to be made. So country of origin labeling would restore competition to the beef supply chain. It would empower consumers to choose where they want their food produced. It will help strengthen the U.S. cattle industry. And then we need to restore competition in the marketplace itself to eliminate the possibility that any four beef packers, for example, can collude, if they wish to, in order to impose additional production standards on producers. We have to respect and admire the entrepreneurial spirit. We have to respect and admire that within a free market system, you have producers who will seek to achieve excellence. And that is how you get the most competitive, the safest, the most wholesome, and most affordable beef in the world, is you let our producers do what they do best. Let our ranchers ranch, as opposed to trying to vertically integrate the entire system, beginning at a global level, in order to dictate to them how they must produce cattle if they want access to the marketplace.
Awesome. I couldn't agree with you more. I have one last question for you. Why do you care so much about this?
So I'm a former rancher from South Dakota. And so I view that I have made full circle. So now where once I ranched, now I represent ranchers. They're the salt of the earth. They're the people who are independently minded. They are the people who are working to achieve excellence. They want to provide the highest quality beef to our consumers in America. They're being run over roughshod by the multinationals and those who continue to support this globalization, which has been an abject failure. And they're willing to stand up and defend their liberties and freedom. And I respect these people, and I'm just proud to represent them.
That's awesome. Well, thank you for what you do.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for everyone who's watching or listening. If you want to learn more, all the links are provided in the show notes. And don't forget to subscribe and share North American Ag Spotlight on YouTube, Rumble, Telegram channels, and the podcast is available on Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, Amazon, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And have a great day. Our newest podcast by North American Ag is called What Color is Your Tractor? The stories behind the ag brands you love and the ag brands you love to hate. Hosted by me, Chrissy Wozniak. We take a deep dive into the companies that have built modern agriculture. Subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform. Go to whatcolorisyourtractor.com. Available on Apple, Amazon, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts.